So today I'm going to introduce you to the topic of psychology by looking at the history of psychology and the major themes within psychology. Psychology is defined as the scientific study of mind, brain, and behavior. The mind is the element of a person that enables them to be aware of the world and their experiences, to think and feel, as well as giving them the faculty of consciousness. This is an intangible construct. You can't touch it, you can't feel it. Behavior is the way in which a person acts in response to a particular stimulus or situation. And often we infer the mind through behavior. I do want to put a caveat here. As we study this semester, I want you to understand that I'm presenting you a very Western perspective of psychology. There are different traditions and different belief systems throughout the world. In fact, the first mental health care facilities in the world were in the Middle East. There are early psychological traditions in China and in Africa. And so don't think that because I simply happen to be talking about American psychology, that I am encapsulating all of world psychology. The major perspectives in psychology are the biological perspective, the psychodynamic perspective, behaviorism, humanism, cognition, evolution, cognitive neuroscience, and cultural community psychology. And they're presented here with the dates at which each perspective has gained prominence within the field. At the top of your screen, you'll see that the same timeline is being represented. And as we go through today's topics, just watch that arrow on the screen. We're going to start with the biological perspective. We're going to start with phrenology. This was Franz Joseph Gall's theory. You can see Franz here and a strange little apparatus for measuring the skull. And he had a good idea. That good idea was that special mental abilities or characteristics are localized within specific regions of the brain. However, he paired this with terrible ideas. The first of which is that we can measure them by looking at the skull. Well, how could we do this? If you work out an area of your brain, perhaps it's right here, it should grow bigger. And when it grows bigger, it pushes the skull out a little bit, and he'll be able to measure that. That's completely wrong. His second problem was his conceptualizations of highly dubious characteristics. This has long since been debunked. Pierre Flourens attempted to argue against Gall's methods. He surgically removed pieces of brain, and what he found was that he could discriminate between hemispheres and major regions of the cortex and see some linkage to cortical processes, but nothing like Gall suggested. Paul Broca was a contemporary. He studied brain-damaged patients. He is famous for discovering Broca's area, an area related to speech. How do we link these really hardcore biological measures to psychology? Well, through physiology. And physiology is the study of biological processes, especially those in the human body. How do we link those to internal thoughts? Well, we can begin with the work of Hermann von Helmholtz, who studied human reaction time and estimated the length of nerve impulses. He could look at a sensory input from the environment, see how long it took you to respond to that sensory input, and be able to determine how long the processes took you. Wilhelm Wundt opened the first psychology laboratory in Leipzig, Germany. A main focus of his research was consciousness. And consciousness is our subjective experience of the world and the mind. And the more we get through this class, the more you're going to realize how very subjective it is. He studied consciousness using structuralism. This is an analysis of the basic elements of the mind. And he would have subjects observe their own experiences through a process called introspection, which involved a form of training that he did. Titchener, one of his students, brought structuralism to the United States. He was an incredibly popular teacher. However, he really intensified this concept of identifying individual elements of the mind and seeing how far he could break them down. Another theory of the time that was very popular was functionalism. How do we move from structuralism over to functionalism? We start with Darwin. And Darwin came up with the theory of natural selection. This is that the features of an organism that help it survive and reproduce are more likely than other features to be passed on to subsequent generations. This inspired William James and the functionalism approach. William James was a heavy hitter within psychology circles. Functionalism is the idea that the purpose that mental processes serve is to enable people to adapt to their environments. Mental processes are not just elements like building blocks we assemble together to make a mind. Mental processes are, in fact, activities our mind performs who allow us to adapt to our environments. At the same time that people were applying experimental theories to the world, people were also attempting to treat patients within the real world. Both Charcot and Pierre Genet treated patients with hysteria. And hysteria is a temporary loss of cognitive or motor functions, usually as a result of emotionally upsetting experiences. Charcot attempted treatments utilizing hypnotic therapies, whereupon Pierre Genet, who was ahead of his time, utilized theories involving a person's level of energy, their efficiencies, their social competencies to treat hysteria. Now, there were other psychodynamic theories that were popular at the time, such as those of Freud, which I won't really be addressing much in this class. A much more helpful approach to treating people with psychological disorders is humanistic psychology, and this is an approach to understanding human nature that emphasizes the positive emotional potential of human beings. This was supported by Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers. Back to theory. Introspection was all well and good, as are psychodynamic methods. The problem with both of them is we can't get a real or objective measure of either of these constructs. And so behaviorism arose in response to the lack of objectivity in these other fields. Behaviorism is an approach that advocates that psychologists restrict themselves to objectively observable behaviors. Some of the founding fathers of this field include Charles Henry Turner, who was probably one of the most influential, if unknown, scientists working at the time. He studied the problems of comparative behavior and the methodologies for measuring learning in different species. John Watson had a goal to predict and then to control behavior. Margaret Washburn wrote extensively on comparative behavior research. Ivan Pavlov conducted the seminal research on the physiology of digestion, which formed the basis of the classical conditioning stimulus response methodology. Now, as we move forward into the 1930s and 1940s, this is when behaviorism became its strongest within the field of psychology. B.F. Skinner is the person most associated with this theory. Behaviorists study learning, which is a relatively permanent change in behavior caused by experience. It's measurable through devices like the Skinner box, which is a little device he built. Can you see it here? It's got a little rat in it, and you can't see it from this image, but there's a tiny bar in there that he can press, and when he presses the bar enough, he gets a reward or a reinforcement. And the idea is the consequences of a behavior will determine its likelihood to occur again, and that's reinforcement.